train a good legal mind in oral history who would essentially be able to go through this and interview all of these people.
Mm-hmm.
And they're probably now of the age of William Rehnquist, and they probably are of the stage of William Rehnquist, and they probably are, I don't know, how long was he on the Supreme Court?
Jackson, I don't know.
Oh, he's
You
from
know?
41 to 54.
So 41 to 54, which means the guys who were 30 in 54 are now 80, 77, 78, the guys who are 25. So you're talking about men who are reasonably senior in life, and I would do those oral history interviews. I also would interview when the Nuremberg prosecutors come up here, I would do an oral history with each of them.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that would be an interesting time to do it when you have the October conference.
Right.
Set aside a couple of hours, do an oral history with each of them. Do it on video, and do it in such a way that you can eventually do an interactive program.
Mm-hmm. But don't they have to know how to do oral histories also?
Yeah, we can. I can be involved and assist you in training the person who could do that. And I think it should be somebody with a great, some sort of legal historian. It's a pretty good thing and I can train them in the oral history elements of it.
That'd be terrific.
And the story that they do is the story of Robert Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And what you should envision creating here really is a description, essentially, a couple of ways. You can shape a nice 15-minute film about the career of Robert Jackson. You can also do an interesting interactive thing, questions you want to ask about Robert Jackson, and then get from the databases all the answers you want.
Mm-hmm.
One of the techniques that's used in some museums, interestingly the Nixon Library does it, is virtually a perpetual press conference. Questions you want to ask the president.
Mm-hmm.
And what you could do here is questions you want to ask about Robert Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
For example, somebody might want to ask about why did he go to Nuremberg?
Sure.
And then you'd have 2 or 3 things. What was the impact of Nuremberg? He lived 7 years after Nuremberg. What was the impact of Nuremberg on his life? What were the war stories he told from Nuremberg?
Mm-hmm.
And you have a range of questions. You probably can do 250, 300 questions that he could then be answered from a database in a very interesting interactive program. It's not a vast quantity of material because it would be absorbed from several hours. And then I think because it's Jamestown, you'd really want to talk about the elements of Jamestown. So you'd have, things from Jamestown, and nobody's alive who was of his boyhood, but there probably are people alive who remember him as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And you do that, so you have a full interactive type of thing.
Now, when you say that, Michael, does that mean people come in and they push a touch screen if they have a certain question?
That's what you do is you compile. The view essentially is that you compile a database, and then you create the frontal element for the database. The frontal element for the database depends on how you're going to use it in the institution. The database is identical. The frontal element is the agent of interactivity with the database. And the agent of interactivity is either you do it where you can get the answer to the following 280 questions, or ask a question in plain language. I mean, I ask a question in plain language, or you press a button, you say boyhood, career as Attorney General, career as Solicitor General. Careers Nuremberg, and each one presses another 7 elements, and you have an interactive touch screen, all of which comes off the same database. So the last thing you do with anything like this is to discover what the frontal element is, because first of all, the technology changes and it becomes more, the one thing we know about technology is it becomes more capable and less expensive. So the technology changes all the way through. And the other is it depends what else you're doing here and what its use is going to be. You also get clearance for this material so that it can go on the web, and you can have web visitors and web interactivity. And what you do is that gives you an outreach beyond the place. But somebody coming into here should have the ability to see a 15-minute, 18-minute. And the reason I say 15 or 18, essentially because that's the limit of what people watch in a museum type of setting.
Attention span.
It's an attention span, and you can do an incredible amount in 15, 18 minutes. I mean, even if you look at the entrance to the Kennedy Presidential Library, there's about an 18-minute film that does a wonderful job of summarizing the whole thing, and that's a complex career and everything else. You do it, it's an exciting way, and it becomes something that the visitorship here can do. There should be, the view that we have of museums, the view that I have of museums is museums, in whatever size exhibit you're doing, are storytelling institutions. And you view it essentially, what is the difference between a movie and a museum? A movie is a captive audience with moving imagery. Went to the movies the other day. What do we have? We have one choice in the movies. You either sit there or you leave. Once you come in, you are in the hands of the director, and he or she owns your time there, and the only vote you have is to leave or to... What the difference is, a museum is a much more... I direct my visit, because in essence what I do is it's captive imagery in a moving audience. And the captive imagery is how you go through it. And if I create an exhibition which is to be seen like this, there will be some character who uses it like a ping pong ball. Goes from there to there, and from there to there, and there to there. And that's the prerogative of it. So what you try to do is you try to do it in such a way that there is one, as it were, permanent exhibition. And then you have the Library of Congress type of exhibition that is rotating, that uses all of the memorabilia that they have. Between them and the Supreme Court, they probably have fantastic memorabilia. You probably also, and I don't know this off the top of my head, but you probably also have some decisions that become, that resonate with contemporary issues. I don't know when in '54 he died. I don't know whether he was part of Brown versus Board of Education, which was a '54 decision.
Yes, he was part of that.
Well, that again has has an overture to society in which you take 4 or 5 decisions and you play them out, and you see the impact of Brown versus Board of Education. I don't know how he voted, but if you look at Brown versus...
Favor of it.
I would assume so, but if you look at that, you look at him being at the cutting edge of 2 of the major human rights issues of the 20th century. Hey, that, a student can pipe up and say, what's the link between the 2? And one of the other things you can do in the exhibition is to integrate the oral histories you've done. So that there is a storytelling element in the exhibition that highlights, again, leaves entree for the special exhibition and leaves other ways of doing it. Now, As to a conference center type of thing, the question becomes, again, what are you going to offer somebody to be up here during the summer? And my assumption is that you can have conferences that are 3 or 4 day types of things, but if you're going to have sustained work, then there need to be fellowships during the summer. And this is a wonderful place to vacation work. It's also a type of thing where if you want to offer the type of things, lawyers writing PhDs or people working in human rights and human activities and that type of stuff would be able to get chunks of time away. You've got office space here. And
Michael, could I ask you a question
Sure.
on that issue? Jackson's major contribution, if you look at all the things the guy stood for, probably was his work at Nuremberg. And if we're going to develop a national reputation as a center of some kind, we don't probably want to duplicate what other people are doing. And we've been thinking, though, that maybe future development of international law as it applies to crimes against humanity may be the kind of thing we could, sponsor law review articles, we could do research grants, we could, try to, but maybe somebody's already doing that. We don't know. So
people,
Even if it is.
people are doing that elsewhere. There are, if you were to think about that, there are a couple of people I would involve in thinking about it. There's a man who's an 81-year-old man, one of the great figures, a fellow named Ben Ferenz. Ben Ferenz was one of the Nuremberg prosecutors. Ben Ferenz has been trying to develop the international court and is as young, vibrant, and vital an 81-year-old as there is in the world, is at the cutting edge of where this is going internationally.
You've mentioned his name.
I've talked to him.
Cutting edge of where it goes internationally. There's also a guy who is an Auschwitz survivor himself, who's a former dean of George Washington University Law School and American University Law School by the name of Tom Bergenthal, who's now an American representative, I think, on the International Court of I'll remember the formal title of the court, but I'm probably misstating it, the International Court of Human Rights. He is at the frontier. He's at the frontier of where we're going in the international community. Judge Goldstone of South Africa, who is one of the prosecutors, was on the South African Supreme Court and became one of the prosecutors at The Hague, is also at this frontier. And I know he's going to be in Boston in November, so you may want to link up with him at that point, and I can give you a contact point with that. He and I are appearing on a program in Boston in November at Facing History, which you know about already.
You want to take a note?
Okay.
There's also another, I attended a fabulous conference in which I learned an awful lot because it was a lawyers' conference, and I only am married to a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm fairly proud of not being a lawyer, sort of. But what that conference dealt with was a very interesting question. In Rwanda, this was about 6 months after the genocide. It dealt on how you establish human justice institutions in the aftermath of the collapse, the complete collapse of society, and the complete collapse of all of the institutions. So you had and they had a comparative study of Argentina in the aftermath of the desperados. You had South Africa in the aftermath of apartheid. You had Chile in the aftermath of dictatorial work. You had Rwanda. You had Bosnia. You had Germany and the like. And there's a wonderful professor at Duke University whose last name I'm forgetting because it sounds very much like the columnist we know, Madeline Marks, but her last name is something roughly like that. Her first name is Madeline, but I'll give you her name.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows all that's being done, because she convened this, she knows all that's being done in the international arena in this type of study. And it was fascinating, because I had only seen it in the Nuremberg context. It was fascinating to see the various ways in which society did this, including how you establish legal norms and juridical norms. And there is a lot of work being done, but this is precisely the type of conference that can be held. My own assumption is that I would make this an adjunct or an affiliate or an off-site, a satellite affiliate of one of the law schools here, either Buffalo or Cornell, merely because of the nature of you're not going to develop a law school here, and its context should be something like that. It also is a good place for them to get people away and to host these types of things. You also, by the way, should think broadly in another way, which is that you could link in a different way in terms of the talent that's brought here. You could probably link with Chautauqua, which brings talent in, and therefore,
Like you.
therefore you have a variety of programs that come off of that, and that add to this. You also could bring certain types of things to the town that make it a programmatic center in a very interesting way. So I think that these are all.
See, I guess my feeling is we can't become everything and succeed. So we're trying to find that mission that defines us, which is a challenge, but it's an opportunity also, because when you have a brand new organization like this, you can, do it.
But
So-
but you want to make it a place too that, for example, high school kids from Rochester would take a half-a-day trip
Right.
and come here. I mean, so you want it not only to be just a conference center, but a place that, through video and artifacts and, his handwritten notes that you can get on loan from the Supreme Court, that it's an exhibition that, you can have high school kids come and learn about, a little piece of American history here, I would think.
I mean, look, clearly if you have an exhibition, one of the clearer things, and you have the sense of it, is it's a wonderful way for students to learn what the Supreme Court is,
Right.
what the nature of appointment to the Supreme Court is, what an argument in the Supreme Court looks like. I mean, to my mind, you have to have stuff like that, which makes it educational.
Well, it's also Attorney General. I mean, it's not. I mean, he had a pretty
You know,
amazing career.
looking there, if a student comes out of this learning what the Solicitor General, the Attorney General is, and an Associate Justice Supreme Court is, that's a reasonably good education for if a kid can come out and identify that. And again, there probably are, people who worked with Jackson in these things who could, who could do that. And then if he learns what war crimes are and what the nature of that is, you've created an exhibition that and a place that really can draw high school students. And part of what we've discovered, I mean, you have two elements with high school students that are fascinating. Number one is that high school students are an evolving population. So if you provide a meaningful visit for 1 year, you have a return visitorship every year because there's always a next class.
Mm-hmm.
And it means that I just can give you an interesting example. The Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, is now drawing 100,000 visitors a year, something they could never imagine. Why? Because they've run a very successful morning program every day of the week, the entire school year, for classes. And what happens is teachers learn that their kids come out having a meaningful, moving experience, and they're booked 5 days a week, 40 weeks of the school year, 39 weeks of the school year. They're not booked in the first week, they're not booked in the last week. But there's a visitorship for you from every school district. Now, imagine if you think in terms of the exhibition that it's an exhibition that should be able to be used in an American history course to teach all of the institutions. And students come here for 2 hours and 15 minutes. Well, you have now gotten yourself the loyal constituency of every single school district within an hour and a half of this place, because that's a way in which they can make the Supreme Court come alive, and the excitement of it, and they can teach human values, social justice. I mean, what more does a teacher want for the spending of a morning or an afternoon? And then you schedule classes for morning and afternoon, and you've got yourself an ultimate constituency. Plus, the other thing about it, which is very interesting, is that if kids go and they have a meaningful experience, kids have siblings, and kids have parents, and kids have grandparents. And we did something at the Holocaust Museum, which is we trained kids to be docents, high school kids to be docents, training high school kids to be docents, which gave them an extra measure. And if you did that with Jamestown High School students, you then have a sense of, you've then developed a core. They bring in all of their people. So I would think in terms of a concise, serious but comprehensive exhibition on the life of Robert Jackson and all the things he stood for, putting him in a larger context, because again, you know, it's an opportunity for kids to learn about the New Deal. It's an opportunity for kids to learn about World War II. It's an opportunity for them to learn also about some of the, you know, I don't know, for example, where he stood on the Supreme Court's decision vis-a-vis the Japanese.
Korematsu.
What?
Korematsu.
Yeah. I mean, but look at the issues he dealt with at this period of time. And either, if you look back on his career, either as Solicitor General, Attorney General, Supreme Court Justice, he probably dealt with every serious issue in the 40s and 50s in the United States, which was a tremendous turning point in American history.
Well, David Wigdor at the Library of Congress, I asked him what he thought we were doing here, and he said he's one of 5 or 6 people in the mid-20th century, he said, that made the difference. That means he's put him in with George Marshall and people like that, you know, in terms of impact. I mean,
well, again, you know, I'm an expert on one area of Justice Jackson's life, which is I'm an expert on what he did when he took off to go to Nuremberg. Equally important, what that meant as a public statement. There was a professor at Northwestern who did a brilliant paper on the 50th anniversary of the Nuremberg trial, whom we should, you know, engage at some point and should give a speech on this. He spoke of Nuremberg as theater. He was his professor of speech and communication. And he said, if you look at Nuremberg as rite, R-I-T-E, as ceremony, with all of the elements involved in that, then what you have is the idea that a man would leave the court, the Supreme Court of the United States, to prosecute this, not to serve as a judge, but to serve as the prosecutor, is symbolically the statement that elevated the trials to the level of, you know, of world revolutionary event. I mean, somebody's going to understand that and what it meant for him. and then the type of work that he did there. It also, I mean, in another way, he also wrestled with the question of, and one can play with this, how do you deal with you know, he dealt with two issues. One issue I learned, because I had originally had a very negative view of Nuremberg, because after all they tried, 22, 23 people. They got bizarrely uneven sentences. Some of them were dismissed very early, and 5 years later some of them were out of court, some of them had been killed. But the world of Nazism was a world of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and you had an emblematic few. But the very interesting thing, again, I learned this in Rwanda, is the desperate need to rebuild that sense of justice. And the fact that this has gone on. You can even relate it, for example, to the much more theological attempt of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the aftermath of South Africa. One was shaped by lawyers, the other was shaped by bishops. Archbishop Tutu was the guy who shaped it. But it's a very interesting, it's a very interesting understanding of how you rebuild in the aftermath. And this was an incredible service to humanity, service to Europe, service to Germany. By the way, one of the sources of donations that you should seek is a donation from the German government or one of its institutions. And I wouldn't ask small, I would ask large, and it would be a very important and emblematic gift if there was such a gift from the German government, because of the recognition of the role that he played in helping to rebuild Germany after the war by virtue of this. And it's, I'm giving you a virtually free association on that,
Yeah.
but that would be a serious source of funding. And they have funding that's set aside in a series of projects that are associated with this, for which this might be a very interesting, very natural.
Just an interesting segue, which tied in a few things that you just talked about, happened yesterday afternoon. A former clerk of Rehnquist, a former clerk of Jackson, who was with Rehnquist, George Niebank, stopped in the office. He gave me a Demitasse cup and dish, and it was inscribed RHJ, and it had been given to Robert Jackson by the people of Nuremberg at the conclusion of the trial as a thank you. It was a set. And Jackson, in turn, as his clerks left, as a souvenir, gave to each of the clerks something from that set. Yesterday,
The challenge is to rebuild that set.
yeah, but it's a story, of what you just said. You just said several things about bringing confidential clerks, the German people, and their recognition of really what Jackson provided. I never connected it until just right now, but ironically, it occurred yesterday afternoon in my office. Unbelievable.
Was the trial widely heard in Germany? Publicized at the time?
The trial was widely publicized in Germany. The problem is that Germany was so fractured at that point that it was in the scales of rebuilding. Nuremberg itself was chosen because it was the only city that wasn't destroyed, and you could rebuild some of the elements of the institutions that were there. By the way, make the note as we speak of Alec Baldwin, who produced for TNT. TNT is Ted Turner, who
Not
also...
anymore.
Oh, it's no longer Turner.
AOL Time Warner.
It's now AOL Time Warner. But but AOL Time Warner. So you have TNT, and the other is Tony Randall, who's doing the Nuremberg show on Broadway.
You're in the business. How does one access an Alec Baldwin?
Talent agent. We have to find out who his agent is. Yeah.
How do you find that out?
We'll try to find that out for you.
Your chairman, Melissa.
I mean,
Yeah,
and
that's
he-
the way, you have to get through, you have to go to their agent. or
He
their
played,
manager,
he
yeah.
played, he played Robert Jackson. He clearly had, he produced the series. He clearly has an affection for him, and is clearly a guy worth talking to.
Oh, absolutely.
He's also done a lot of work on Jackson because, he financed the research and all of that stuff. And
He
you have
produced it, didn't he? I mean, he
What?
produced, wasn't that his production?
his production,
Yeah.
and he started it. But he also had people who, before they wrote the script, essentially did the work. So you have groups that have looked at Jackson at Nuremberg. He also, they've been through that. Again, you got to piggyback on work that other people have done. They've been through the National Archives and they've gotten whatever film footage there is of the trial. They've gotten the film footage of what was shown at the trial, because one of the things that Jackson wrestled with was he tried to make it a case of documents. The idea was that the German documents themselves would convict these people, and about midway through the trial, he feared that he had lost the sense of the overwhelming purpose of this, and a sense of the visceral element, because these were not criminals in the dockets in the sense of they looked like thugs. These were very distinguished looking gentlemen. So he introduced cinema and used the visuals. And one of the interesting things, again, would be the sense of leadership on that. And one of the other things is to get a sense of the core decisions, how he dealt with both the legal and the emotive thing of it, because both of these were at stake. So I think that you go to an Alec Baldwin. The first thing I would do with an Alec Baldwin is not ask him for money, but ask him for advice. And then eventually, and one of the things that Melissa will say is Hollywood stars like very much to be approached for their mind instead of their bodies, and instead of their money, because everybody's approaching them on all the other directions. So if you say, look, you did this, who are some of the people you worked with? And the other, frankly, element is you have people who have worked through these issues. So they have material, they have notes, they have stuff that are involved in that. And, they have all the sense of the visuals as well.
So there's a drawer, cabinet someplace for stuff that they've gathered together, some of which they've used, some of which they haven't used, but it's there.
Or, it's somewhere. I mean,
Well, and I'm sure there's biographers, there's biographers of Jackson also.
There's one. He's 89 years old, and he was here May 1st.
Really?
He gave the only speech.
Wow. Okay.
But there are probably Supreme Court historians. who've
Oh
written
yeah,
it.
absolutely. There's a lot of biographies, but as far as a
I
book,
mean, I don't know the legal thing, but I think there are a series of people, whom I think you can enlist in discussion. I would be happy to assist you professionally, working who did the Nuremberg elements of Court TV. And again, they're a good partner to be able to work with you. There are a variety of ideas that they might come up with and be able to do it. And I would be also interested in working with you when you come time for the development of what you'd consider the permanent exhibition, in the sense of understanding the story to be told and how you tell it in a museum context. And then again, as you plan the building, you got to see what spatial dimensions you need for that.
Mike was instrumental in much of what the Holocaust Museum in Washington
absolutely. How does the Jackson story and the Holocaust Museum overlap? I mean, some of it seems obvious, some of it's probably not very obvious.
The Jackson story overlaps only in the following. We have a section at the end called the trials, And the trials, in essence, have 4 segments. They have the Nuremberg trials, they have the Eichmann trial, they have the German Nuremberg 1 and Nuremberg 2. Nuremberg 2 has all of the doctor trials and all of that stuff. And the doctor trials have taken on added importance because I would bet none of you, even if you're lawyers, know this, that they introduced brand new concepts into medical ethics. For example, the notion of informed consent never existed until 1947 with the decision at Nuremberg. What is absolutely central to contemporary medical ethics, when you get a form in which the doctor explains to you what he's about to do to you, and you have to sign that, that never existed in medical ethics till they came with 10, as it were, commandments that the doctors had violated. And they came up with 10 principles as part of the Nuremberg decision, which are the foundation stone: the right to refuse treatment, the right to get out of experimentation, the idea that experimentation that is going to do damage without promising results cannot be undertaken on the human beings unless the doctor or the experimenter himself or herself is the first to take the material. In other words, if you're going to endanger somebody else, you've got to endanger yourself first. I mean, there are, and most important of all being informed consent. So all of this becomes, but in the Holocaust Museum, this plays a role just at the end. But the Holocaust Museum has all of the films available from Nuremberg. It has all of that material. It has all of the photographic elements available. It has all of the library holdings of it. So one of the places you turn to is the Holocaust Museum. And they would, be of assistance. And I, in my work today, am a great consumer of the Holocaust Museum, in the sense that I just did a film in which we used their film archives and their photo archives, their documentary archives. I mean, what it's designed to be is one-stop shopping for creative projects in this area, in which you come in, you make use of what they have. And so much of this material is public domain that it's really quite terrific.
Yeah.
And they also, they would know, as I will know, who the filmmakers are who produce this type of stuff. I mean, that's stuff that we can do very easily.
It's terrific.
And there are people, the people I would engage, again, I'd speak to a Ben Ferenz and a Tom Bergenthal. I'll give you the woman at Duke.
Right.
As to what type of niche you could find. You have to regard yourselves, for want of a better term, as a boutique type of thing, in keeping with your spirit, because you're not a law school, you're not a major library, so you have to have a boutique role in which the more the place becomes a site, a commemorative site, the more it can be embodied in that.
Just listening, I'm not part of this group, but it just seems to
Well,
me...
you will be before you get done, Joe.
I'm afraid of that, and I look forward to it,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. But just listening, it just seems you have so much more to offer than oral histories. It's one thing, these names and sources, and Michael going to them, and we're going to them is a little bit different. And I mean, the availability of the wide range in the U.S. and overseas, and his backup, Melissa, it's something I think bears consideration way beyond what he suggested.
We are at a very unique opportunity in the history of this organization. As I mentioned on the way down, we've got funding at least to kick it off. We've got a foundation that is currently considering covering our operations for the first 5 years while we figure out what we are. You'd say, unbelievable. And we've got a foundation right now that's assisting us, and these are architects.
Can I tell you something? Having heard that, the only thing I can say to you is I know of no other institution that is in that type of... I listen to institutions every day that have, fully developed ideas and are starving for the next, the next way to send postage out. And this is the first institution I've ever heard of that
Is
is.
there any contact with his descendant? I'm sure there's some
The
descendants.
Interestingly enough, let me introduce Harold Adams, he's the nephew of Robert Jackson.
Oh, great.
He's on our board and is
Very
the descendant who has had personal relationships with
Family
the family members.
He was in the army at the end of the war, and went over, his uncle invited him to Nuremberg for a couple of days.
Oh, wow.
Harold's story,
So you need an oral history as well.
he is the source of the Robert
Personal,
Jackson family history.
Well, that's an important. That's again. That's a very important. It's a very important type thing. There also, my other interesting piece of advice on this is you probably could get someone who is doing a PhD in legal history, who with suitable funding and a double type of thing would be very interested in doing the Robert Jackson, if not biography, then doing a lot of this work and then
Sure.
absorbing it for their
Or
own
law
work.
students during the summer.
We have a professor.
Or a historian, a good,
No,
good historian.
One person takes it from start to finish, yeah.
There is a professor who found us. This is part of the moons aligning. Named John Barrett, and in fact, he's at St. John's Law School in New York, and he has grabbed this with a great sense of emotion. He, in fact, together with me, have contacted these Nuremberg prosecutors. He's the perfect guy to talk about getting the techniques of oral history. Now, he's, as far as knowing the facts, knowing what to ask for, he's there. As to how to grab it for the purposes of videography for our use at another time, that's where we need Michael.
Well,
Berenbaum.
that's where we can
52,000 of them.
we can put if you choose a guy like that,
Yeah.
then I can work with him and we can go forward on that.